Okay, hello everyone. I think we're live. It's my great pleasure to sit down with Dr. Rick Johnson from Colorado, University of Colorado in Denver. And Rick is, a nephrologist, a very prominent nephrologist, and has done a ton of really interesting research that I find very, very interesting. That also impacts a lot of what we are doing in my lab at UCSB. And so I thought we'll chat with Rick about things such as his book that came out late last year, right? Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. Amazing story in there. So we will have plenty to talk about there. And the book is all about things such as fructose and uric acid. And of course, uric acid is also very interesting to us with regard to kidney disease. So we can talk about lots of angles there. So welcome, Rick. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Thomas. It's great to be on.
Yeah, excellent. So I would say for people that may not know you very well, let's first figure out who Rick Johnson is. So you're obviously a nephrologist. You're in Colorado. I already gave that away. But how did you get there? What was your career path that brought you to become a faculty member in Colorado?
Yeah. Well, my father was in academic medicine, and I originally was going to be an archaeologist, but during college, I got interested in medicine. And I ended up being very inquisitive when I went to medical school in Minnesota, and decided that it would be fun to have not just clinical practice, but to do research. And I ended up in kidney disease because of some very strong mentors that got me interested in kidney disease, including Belding Scribner, who was the guy that started dialysis. And he hired me as his last fellow before he retired. And then I worked with the great Bill Kauser, who is another famous kidney specialist. And I got the bug to do research, and my research took me from the kidney to high blood pressure, to uric acid, to gout, to sugar, to diabetes, obesity, and chronic kidney disease. And I spent my career kind of following where my research takes me. But a lot of it has been on trying to figure out the causes of kidney disease, and also the obesity and diabetes. So I tend to go for big questions. So that's me.
Sure. Okay, excellent. Yeah. So you already mentioned, you're doing lots of research, but you're also a practicing nephrologist. So it's kind of a little bit of both. What is more?
Yeah, if I look tired, it's because I was on call all weekend.
You don't look tired.
Okay, well, that's good because I am tired.
Okay, excellent. And how does that balance out, on an average week? Is it like a 50-50 kind of thing? Do you do more of one or the other?
Well, over the years, I've probably spent about 25-30% of my time in the clinic, and probably 2/3 in research. But I also was a chief at several different universities, and so that I had administrative work and education. I edited one of the main textbooks for kidney disease called Comprehensive Clinical Nephrology. It's a very popular textbook. So I keep myself busy. I'm trying to wind down the clinical work these days and spend a little bit more time on research. But there have been years that I've done, maybe 50% of my time is research, is clinical.
Right. Good, excellent. Yeah, and I know you have been well funded with NIH grants and all those things. So that's amazing. Well, let's talk about what's in here, which is a really interesting story. Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and I think the book is, of course, not meant to be an excuse to just be fat and stay fat and do nothing about it, right? So that's not the idea. The idea, I think, is to find an explanation why we have this epidemic of obesity going on. And I just go ahead. How did this all start?
Well, you got it. So the book Nature Wants Us to Be Fat kind of represents some breakthroughs in our work trying to figure out the cause of obesity. And the kind of trick that we used among other things, was not to come at obesity like it's a disease, but rather as something that animals in the wild will sometimes purposely become obese to help them survive. And, you know, the old story of the hibernating bear, right? Everyone knows that the bear gets really fat and then he sleeps through the winter. And during that time when it's hibernating, it lives off its fat. And the fat provides the calories, because when you break down fat, you make energy. And you also make water. When you break down fat, you make water. And so fat is a survival. I mean, it helps animals survive. And there are many, many species, from ants and insects and, you know, fish, lungfish, and all these different species that will use fat to help them survive during periods when food is not available. And when we studied this, we said, you know, here's what does the animal do to become fat? Because normally animals keep their weight right, just like we do when we're young. We can eat anything we want, but we won't gain weight. So we knew there was a switch that animals use to gain weight, and we identified it. We think we did, at least, and it turns out that animals eat a lot of fructose, which is a sugar that's present in fruit. But you know, we know fruit is pretty healthy, and for us it is, because we only eat, you know, small amounts of fruit, and the fruit contains all these wonderful things that kind of neutralize and help us. But the fructose itself really is a nutrient that actually tries to get us to store fat. And you know, a bear will eat 10,000 grapes in a day, and we'll eat, you know, 10 grapes or something. So there's a big difference in what we're doing. And it turns out that fructose is unique among foods. And when you eat fructose, it actually tricks the system. You know, we have in our bodies, we make energy, and we live, when we eat food, we're generating energy from the food we eat. And the type of energy that we are using from moment to moment has a special name. It's called ATP. And it's some people say it's the currency, it's the money in the bank. But the ATP is what we make, that we use to walk, talk, think, run. Everything we do involves ATP. And that is the active energy. But stored energy is the other type of energy. And when you store energy, it's fat, basically, or starch or glycogen. But mainly it's fat. And so the old theory was that the way we get fat is we eat more than we need, and that excess energy, you know, more than we use, and more, you know, so if we eat too much, that excess energy caps off the ATP, so we keeps the ATP full, and then the extra energy goes into fat. That was the theory. But what we found, and which was so exciting, is that fructose drops the ATP in the cell and fixes it at a lower level. So it creates a low energy state. And then when the food comes in, instead of replenishing the ATP, it goes straight into the fat. And there's this thing called metabolic inflexibility, when you're eating fructose, you can't break down fat very well. So you can't break down the fat to replace the ATP. So the ATP levels stay low for a while. And then as the ATP levels slowly fill up, but at the expense that you've eaten too much and you've stored a lot of fat. And so that's how it works. So the trick is even though you have plenty of energy, you've got fat on you, you've got stored energy, your total energy is high because you got all this fat. Inside, they make your active energy low. And when that happens, it makes you hungry, forage for food, and start gaining weight. And so we realized that fructose was unique, and we did a million studies on it, and we came to the conclusion that this one food turns out to be the food that drives energy intake. It's the one that seems to activate this biologic switch. And then we had
actually, can I just interrupt for a second, because there was just so much science there. Let me just see if I can recap it and if it still makes sense. So because there was a ton of really great information there. So, one thing, of course, that's always important to keep in mind is that we humans, we did not evolve in the last 50 years, right? We've been around a lot longer, and our genes came from much earlier species, and everything that controls our metabolism is also true in much earlier evolutionary times. So nothing is like a really brand new invention for us humans. And that's something, whenever I give a research talk, I try to remind people of that because that seems to be forgotten sometimes. And oftentimes people don't think in terms of evolution. And so in the good old days, when we were hunter-gatherers, food was not plentiful like it is right now, right? So we didn't have bakeries everywhere, and we didn't have refrigerators and food pantries and so on. So our intake of food was very much controlled by the environment, right? If we had, whether we had luck hunting or not, and whether there was anything to gather or not. And then there's also seasons, right? And I think that's where the fructose, to my understanding, the fructose really comes in, because we humans would have consumed in those good old days fructose primarily from fruit, which become ripe in the kind of like late summer, fall-ish, right, type of time, right before the winter. And that's when we need to actually fatten up a little bit so we can survive the long periods of winter time where there isn't anything to eat and everything is covered by snow, depending on where you live. Is that about right? So there's a bit of a seasonality in what we're eating, and fructose is not around all the time, right? Okay.
That's right. Cool. So, and like animals will, in the warm, there's some hot seasons like in Madagascar where primates like lemurs will actually eat the fruit, and then they will hibernate during the dry season because there's no water around. They'll use the fat to provide them water. So it's really interesting how all these animals rely on this. And, it was great for humans in our past too, because there were periods of time when we had to actually survive periods when it was rough in our ancestors, and it looks like the fruit actually helped us as well. There's a story there. But what's interesting is today we're eating huge amounts of fructose, and it's in the form of sugar. So table sugar and high fructose corn syrup are basically fructose and glucose combined together. And and fructose, so you can, about 15% of our diet is coming from added sugars, and they contain this fructose. And when you drink a soft drink, it's like giving yourself a slug of fructose, and it activates, drops the energy in the system, makes you hungry, and you start eating more, and all those things. And so, initially our work suggested it was all sugar. It was basically table sugar and high fructose corn syrup. And we drew curves, and you could see that the intake of high fructose corn syrup correlated with the rise in obesity and diabetes and hypertension and heart disease. And, it looked like that was the main driver, and it probably is the main driver. But what this disappointing thing in some respects is that we discovered that other foods that we also love can make when we eat it acts on our body, and our body will make fructose. So we can make fructose from carbs. So things like potatoes and rice, which do not contain fructose, they're really starchy foods. And starchy foods are mainly glucose. But when you eat those foods, some of that glucose gets converted to fructose. And we actually were able to prove it in animals. It's been proven in people actually. And so you can make a fair amount of fructose from carbs, and particularly from high glycemic carbs like potatoes, rice, chips, crackers, cereal, bread. Oh my gosh, I love bread. Thomas, I love bread. And if I eat a lot of bread, I notice I start gaining weight. And that's because the bread is being converted to fructose in my body. Now, some of the carbs also stimulate insulin, and there's a very big theory out there that insulin, when you eat carbs, the insulin's causing the fat. And we actually did experiments in animals, and we were able to show there is an insulin pathway for fat. But when the glucose goes up in the blood, it's also being converted to fructose. And it turns out that the fructose pathway is stronger when it comes to things like causing diabetes or insulin resistance. And so they're both important, but it turns out that fructose is driving a lot of things. And one of the surprises in the book is that salty foods can actually stimulate fructose production, because salt kind of it activates the system that converts the glucose to fructose. And it's sort of important, because when you're eating salt, you start getting thirsty, because you're it's sort of like dehydrating yourself. The salt concentration goes up in your blood. And so the body thinks that it needs water. And one way to get water is to make fat, because when you have fat, you can produce water in times of need. So anyway, so it's kind of a interesting story. I do encourage anyone who is interested in the cause of obesity and diabetes and also chronic kidney disease. It kind of goes through some of the state-of-the-art work and has some surprises. Like, did you know that salt can cause obesity? Well, it can. We give salt to animals and they become fat, not just hypertensive, but they become fat. So it's sort of interesting.
Right. Yeah. All right. So, but fructose seems to be at the center of many things that kind of like now in our high-tech civilization come back to bite us. But it used to be a good thing. But it used to give us a survival advantage because we were able to fatten up and then survive starvation periods and so on. Right?
Yeah. There's back in the Muhammad you would talk about how honey and sugar or fructose, like figs and honey, were good things because they could help people. But back then, it was important to maintain body weight, and this just helped you maintain the body weight, because they're often they would wear fig strings, these strings of figs, when they would cross the desert, and things like that. So it's really interesting. But today, we just published a paper. I don't know if you saw it, but we published a paper a few weeks ago showing that Alzheimer's disease is very likely from this pathway, because when you eat foods that produce fructose, especially like high glycemic carbs like rice and potatoes, or like salty foods, you produce fructose in your body, but you also produce it in the brain. And for a long time, people didn't really, there's been this mystery of, what could be driving Alzheimer's disease. And, there was all this focus on the amyloid plaques and the tau protein, but most of the therapies aimed at trying to block those things have not been that effective. So people have been saying, well, if it's not the amyloid plaques, what's causing the Alzheimer's? But they find that very early on, that you can find evidence of insulin resistance in the brain. And so there seems to be this insulin resistance, and there's an impaired production of ATP. The cells aren't making as much ATP, and the ATP levels are low. And this is what fructose does. And it also causes a low-grade inflammation. This is what it does. It lowers the energy. It induces insulin resistance. And so what what people have found is that if you give fructose to animals, you can, and sugar and foods that cause fructose production, you can show that fructose levels go up in the brain and that they can cause insulin resistance and drop the ATP levels. And if you look at people with Alzheimer's and you measure fructose levels in the brain, they're high. And so it's very likely that this is playing a role in Alzheimer's. And so we published that recently. It's gotten quite a bit of press, but it was more like a review than it was primary research. But the story is pretty strong.
That's amazing. Okay. So you're saying fructose, even if you ingest it, can make it into the brain? Is that part of it as
So
well?
it's very interesting. When you ingest fructose, only 1% gets to the brain, but fructose actually, when you ingest fructose, it actually stimulates the brain to make fructose.
Oh, I see.
And the
Okay.
exact mechanism is still not totally clear for fructose,
Mhm.
but with high glycemic carbs, it's very clear. As the blood glucose goes up, the brain starts making fructose.
Hmm.
And same thing if you eat salt, the brain starts making fructose. So that's more clear.
Right.
But yes, the answer is yes. And if you give sugar to animals, after about 8 weeks, they have trouble getting through a maze. And
Mhm.
after 18 weeks, they actually start developing amyloid in their brain. So it's really strong. It's sort of interesting. What we think it is a forage. It's like a foraging response because when you eat fructose, you start to animals want to forage, and foraging requires animals to search for food in areas where it may be dangerous, and so
Mhm.
they have to be risk taking, and they have to move fast, and they can't deliberate very long. They have to kind of be looking around all the time, and they have to reduce their self-control because an animal that has good self-control isn't going to want to go into the lion's den, to get some food, and because it's too dangerous. So the way fructose does that is it inhibits the blood flow and the glucose uptake in regions of the brain that are involved in self-control and recent memory and attention.
Mhm.
And these are the same regions where Alzheimer's develops. And the areas of the brain that are stimulated by fructose are the areas that are protected in Alzheimer's. And
Mhm.
in Alzheimer's, there's this very common thing where you get this thing called a wandering response, where like 6 or 7 out of 10 people with Alzheimer's will. It's sad. They can just wander off, and it's sort of dangerous. And that may be a carryover of this foraging response. So there's a
Mhm.
real link there.
Interesting. Okay. And then, so if the brain starts making a lot of fructose, it, according to the mechanism, it would also run out of energy, right?
Right.
Because the ATP levels go down. Could this be an explanation for epilepsy, for example, which is also actually triggered by high carbohydrate diets and
Yes, and a low,
reverse,
exactly,
reverse,
absolutely. So if you give carbs that generate fructose in the brain, you will drop ATP levels, and
right,
that theoretically could activate and cause seizures. And
right.
there's now some really beautiful studies of low carb diets and keto diets being used not just to treat seizures, but now people are beginning to apply
Mhm.
this to things like Alzheimer's
Right.
and also attention to deficit disorder and things like that. And it's a very exciting area.
Mhm.
And there have been some incredible, responses with some, the case reports sort of thing. So
Right.
yeah, it's a really exciting area, and I do
Mhm.
believe that there's a lot to this biologic pathway turns out to be very important in a lot of diseases, not just obesity and diabetes. So, I do talk about this in my book, and I encourage you guys, if you're interested in that,
Mhm.
to check it out.
Good. Excellent.
Yeah.
And so how does now uric acid come into play here? So there's a connection between fructose and uric acid, which
Yeah.
doesn't seem intuitive on first glance, but you kind of worked it out. And
Yeah,
maybe do you want to tell that story?
sure. So uric acid is this substance that everybody has. Okay, we all have it. It's kind of a breakdown product from not. It's basically a breakdown product from DNA and RNA and what we call nucleotides. So we have protein, fat, carbs, but we also have these nucleic acids that make up the DNA and our genes. And energy is actually made up of these nucleotides. And when they break down, when the energy breaks down, and in this process where fructose drops the energy in the cell, the energy kind of these ATP molecules get broken down and they produce uric acid. and then the uric acid levels go up inside the cell, and then they spill out into the circulation. Now, most people know of uric acid because it's associated with the disease gout. And there's about probably 8 to 10 million people in this country that have gout. And it's a very painful arthritis. It's like an attack of arthritis. It typically hits the big toe or the ankle, the knee. And so it's a disease associated with crystallization of the uric acid into the joints. And everyone carries uric acid, but people with gout have high uric acid levels, and those high uric acid levels can lead to crystals. But it's also present inside the cell, and when the uric acid goes up inside the cell, it tends to act on those energy factories. And what it does is it stimulates oxidative stress to the energy factories. The uric acid itself doesn't cause the oxidative stress. It recruits an enzyme that produces oxidative stress. And, and so it's called NADPH oxidase for those who care. But basically, what that does is that oxidative stress, basically, it's like an attack on the mitochondria, and the mitochondria respond by making less ATP. And initially, it just stuns it. It's a temporary thing. The oxidative, you eat fructose, the uric acid goes up in the cell. It stuns the mitochondria. They make less ATP. And the calories that we are eating go to fat. And then as this thing wears off, then everything goes back to normal. Then you eat more fructose and you stun it, and you do that again. But if you're chronically eating a lot of sugar or producing a lot of fructose, over time, these mitochondria, or these little energy factories, get damaged to the point where they can't make that much energy, even on a regular, even when there's no fructose around. And so this is associated with this process of aging, and it's associated with this process of becoming fatigued and losing energy as we get older, and getting more tired. Part of this is directly linked. There's actually studies that link it. So anyway, uric acid turns out to have a real biology. It was meant, though, to help us by reducing the ATP production and slowing the system. It was meant to help us during times when there wasn't a lot of food around. It kind of put us in a low mode, low energy mode. When the computer says low battery and everything kind of slows down. So it's meant to be that, but when you keep eating it, the uric acid gets higher and higher. And you can imagine, because this process is linked with sugar and all these things that drive fat, people who get gout often are overweight, and people are often diabetic. And the high uric acid is probably playing a role to some extent in this process. And there's some evidence in animals in particular that the uric acid can have a role in driving some of the blood pressure responses, and some of the obesity, and some of the insulin resistance. And when you lower it in people, you can see some evidence for that as well. It's not like the overwhelming thing. There's other mechanisms going on, and I think one of the problems is that there's this normal wear and tear on the mitochondria that occurs over time. So if you've been obese for a very long time, your mitochondria are already reduced in number, so you have to actually rejuvenate them to help to, and that's why exercise is so important in weight loss, because it helps rejuvenate those mitochondria. But the uric acid is it's a big player. And so,
yeah. Let me recap to readjust it. So fructose, as part of sugar, is causing elevation in uric acid, and that the uric acid itself, can be an oxidative stressor for mitochondria, and as a powerhouse in our cells. Kind of changes the metabolism by kind of damaging the mitochondria themselves, and our cells kind of flips their metabolism maybe away from mitochondrial function and more towards using actually carbohydrates, directly.
Right. That's
I would
exactly.
assume through glycolysis, right?
Yes.
So sort of like as a Warburg effect, but
Yes, it
caused.
drives the Warburg effect.
Okay, excellent. All right. And the Warburg effect, of course, is underlying many forms of cancer. So cancer cells love the Warburg effect because it helps them survive hypoxia and things like that. And
Yeah, I can tell you an interesting story about this because
right.
we published a paper on this last year. So it's known that a high uric acid is associated with cancers too, and that obesity can be associated with cancers. And the main one are breast cancers, colon cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer. These are like the big ones associated with obesity. And obesity is associated with fructose intake, and fructose intake is associated with high uric acid. And there are studies showing that the high uric acid is a risk factor for these cancers, and that a high uric acid, even genetically raising the uric acid, is associated with these cancers. In other words, if you carry genes that make your uric acid a little higher, that carries a risk for these cancers too. And we know that uric acid suppresses these energy factories, and the energy factories use oxygen to make energy. And so when you suppress it, you're actually reducing your oxygen needs, because the mitochondria use a lot of the oxygen we breathe to make ATP. So if they make less ATP, we use less oxygen. So it can help an animal that is in an environment where there's not as much oxygen. And the way it gets around that to make your ATP is there's this primitive system, as you mentioned, called glycolysis, where you can make ATP without any oxygen present. So when you eat fructose, what happens, and when you raise uric acid, you shift away from using oxygen to glycolysis. And so you're in a low energy state and you're using less oxygen. And some animals, like the naked mole rat, when he burrows down in the holes, switches to fructose metabolism so that it can survive in the low oxygen burrows, because there's not much oxygen down there. So what we realize is that this might be a mechanism for driving cancer. And so actually a guy named Lou Cantley, who's a brilliant scientist, has done a lot of work showing that fructose is a fuel for cancers. And high fructose corn syrup, a lot of cancers like it because when a cancer metastasizes, when it spreads, when it gets to another organ, it doesn't have oxygen, it doesn't have a blood supply. So it has to make its own blood supply. And so for a while, it's living in a low oxygen state. It moves into a tissue, but it doesn't have any blood bringing it oxygen. And so it has to live in a low oxygen state. So it loves fructose because it can help it survive. And so, and it loves uric acid because it will help it survive. So what we did is we took animals and we raised, this was done by Mady Finney here at the University of Colorado, but we raised uric acid in these mice. And then we had other mice with normal uric acid, and we injected them with breast cancer cells. And in the animals with a high uric acid, the breast cancer cells spread very rapidly. We could show that it could metastasize and grow much more rapidly. So it's not that the uric acid is causing cancer, but it's allowing it to spread. So, my teaching for you guys is that if one of you do have cancer, I hope none of you do, but if one of you has cancer, be aware that soft drinks have been associated with increased risk for cancer growth, and high uric acid as well. And what you can do to help prevent that is, don't eat a lot of sugar. And there's actually this thought that, especially for colon cancer, that it may help people. And there's people who have argued that it might be as good as chemotherapy to really reduce the sugar, but it hasn't been proven. So, but it looks like you could really help by doing that. Now, if you're not eating anything at all, and it's just important to eat whatever you can eat. So it's a different story if you really can't get any food down. But if you do have that ability to choose your foods, and you're worried about cancer metastases, try to really reduce the sugar intake. I don't mean totally eliminate it. It would be very difficult in this world. But yeah, if you can be in a low carb diet, it would help.
Right. Yeah. So actually, let's speak about translating things into clinical practice, right? So
Yes.
we know from your research and lots of other research that high carbohydrate diets can't be good, and in fact they're very bad, and they're causing obesity and diabetes and all Alzheimer's disease. We talked about cancer is probably driven by it to a large part. So the reverse of a high carbohydrate diet is a very low carbohydrate diet, or also called a ketogenic diet, right? So and of course, these days it's actually called ketogenic metabolic therapy. I like that term because it sounds more sciencey, more. And what that is of course, you limit your carbohydrate to very small amount, 20 grams a day, or maybe 50, depending on the person. But there are only 3 macronutrients, right? So there's carbs, there's fat, there's protein. So something has to give, but you have to increase something else. And in a ketogenic diet, you primarily increase fat, but also, depending on the diet, sometimes protein. But you just essentially get rid of as much carbohydrate as possible. And that has a very dramatic consequence on the body, because it now all of a sudden changes our entire metabolism from using carbs and glycogen and so on over to using our fat reserves, right? So you can actually force, of course, the body into a permanent fat burning mode that way. And
you're right, and
Mhm.
your work has really been very powerful here, because these ketones that are generated, when you're burning fat, you produce these ketones, and they can actually be used as fuel as well. But they have all these other benefits, and one of the incredible benefits is their anti-inflammatory effects. This is an understated but really powerful system that really can help reduce inflammation. So your ketocitra, has this beta hydroxybutyrate and other ketones that are very anti-inflammatory. So that's a very positive thing, so you can actually get your ketones without having to go on a low carb diet.
Right.
But I do think being on a low carb diet is a good move, and for a lot of people, I think right now a lot of people are eating about half of their diet is carbs, and that may be a little too much, to be honest. If you look back in the past and the history, maybe the carbs should be closer to 30-40% than 50. And we know that even with a regular diet, carbs, even without having sugar in your diet, you're making some fructose even then. And we did a study with normal mice and mice that couldn't metabolize fructose, because we had genetically modified them so they couldn't metabolize fructose. And then we just put them on a regular kind of a standard diet, 50% carb diet, very much like us. And when the animals got old, the animals that could not metabolize fructose, even though they weren't getting fructose, they were just getting carbs, they were healthier, and they lived longer, and they were lean, and they didn't get kidney disease with age, and they didn't get hypertension. And so my belief is that we're probably eating a little too much carbs, and if we could cut back on the carbs, that would be a great benefit. So tonight, when you go for dinner and the potatoes are there, you try to avoid the potatoes, or just take a small portion. And the same thing with the rice and the bread. Right. And another trick, there's all these little tricks, try to eat the carbs in the middle of the meal or towards the end of the meal, because if you eat salad first, which is great because there's lots of fiber, and And that will help slow the absorption of the carbs, and so the glucose won't go up as high because there's all the fiber and other foods that slow the absorption. And so that will be good because then your glucose won't go as high, and then you won't stimulate as much insulin, but you also won't make as much fructose. So, but if you do the trick where you go to the restaurant or whatever, and they bring out that big basket of bread and you eat all the bread right away, immediately the glucose levels go up, and you're like behind. You're catching up. Everything is downhill from there. And another trick is to drink a glass of water with each meal. So we found that keeping the salt concentration in the blood low really is helpful. So if you eat that salty food and then you get thirsty, you've already activated this survival switch, this switch to help put on fat. Whereas if you drink water first and lower the serum sodium, you won't activate it. So drink water before the meal and then during the meal. But if you just made that push to drink a glass of water before you start eating, you will lose weight. I've had quite a few people email me, and that's the simplest thing I've ever seen. Just drink a glass of water before each meal. And snacks are tricky because a lot of snacks are processed foods and salty and sugary, and so they can get you because they'll activate the switch. You're not diluting it down with lettuce and whatever else. So snacks are dangerous. I would try to cut out snacks and wait till the meal, and water, carbs, middle or last.
Yeah. All right. So the switch, you call it the switch, which I think is actually a really good description, because in evolutionary times, there was a need for a switch. If there's an apple tree full of ripe apples, you kind of have to eat them right then and there because they go bad. You kind of need to eat the whole apple tree. Your clan has to just stop eating everything else and just focus on those and store all that energy in fat for a rainy day, so to speak. So that's where the switch comes in, and it, according to your research and explained in your book, it's triggered by fructose, and uric acid plays a role. But then there's one more little twist, which is of course very interesting. So we humans are animals, but other animals have an enzyme called uricase that we humans don't have. So we somehow, recently actually lost that enzyme, and that enzyme usually kind of detoxifies uric acid, right? It gets rid of the uric acid, turns it into something that's more soluble, so the kidneys can excrete it. So how did that happen? Why have we lost uric acid?
So when we were studying this, and we realized that uric acid was higher in humans than other animals, other mammals in particular. So humans have much higher uric acid to begin with, and when we eat sugar, our uric acid levels go up dramatically compared to a regular mammal. So, and it turns out like that if you're a rat, you have to eat a ton of sugar to start. Well, you have to eat a lot of sugar to start getting fat. We can make them very fat, but humans are much more sensitive to sugar. We get fat much easier with sugar. And so the question is, and we have higher uric acid. So I was thinking, why did we have this mutation that made our uric acid levels go up? And so I started reading about it, and the mutation occurred like 15 million years ago when our ancestors were living on fruit. And there was this world expert who'd studied these ancestors, and he had discovered, along with others, that there was a huge, there was global cooling that occurred, and these ancestors of ours almost went extinct. And it was at that time that the mutation occurred. And so I was very interested that maybe the mutation was a survival mutation that helped them survive during that time, because when they were basically starving, and these apes, you can tell that they were starving because they get these like striations on their teeth that sort of looks like tree rings. And it's because during the time when there's not any food around, the enamel doesn't grow. And so you get these like, this is in growing in animals where their incisors are still growing. And so I flew over to London and had a special meeting with this world expert. He'd trained with Leakey, and he really knows everything about this period of time. And he was also a paleobotanist, and he knew, and he pointed out that what happened was that these animals started starving when the fruit trees started disappearing, and particularly in Europe, as it got cooler, there was a loss of the fruit trees, especially the fig. And that's when they started to starve. And that was when they came out of the trees, basically, and started foraging for any other kinds of foods. And they had to change their skeletons. They eventually became upright. They had to learn how to dig for tubers. So they actually had to learn how to use their hands and their teeth got stronger. There were all these things that happened. It was a very rapid period in evolution, and this is when the mutation occurred. And so he and I talked about the fact that maybe this could have helped the animals survive when there wasn't so much fruit around. And so to test that, we took mice that had uricase, and we inhibited the uricase so that it would raise the uric acid. And when we did, they became much more sensitive to sugar. It was much easier. With just small amounts of fructose, were able to kind of induce fat in the liver and raise their blood pressure and all these things. And then we actually, with Eric Gauscher, a great scientist, we actually resurrected the extinct genes and did all these studies and basically showed that it really is true that this, that this enzyme actually was a survival enzyme. So, when the mutation occurred, that raising the uric acid acted to help the animals survive. Right. So it's known as a thrifty gene, because it's a gene that helped prevents animals from starving by helping put on fat, but it didn't make the animals fat because there wasn't that much fructose around. It just helped prevent them from dying. And then when you put them in a setting where a Western diet where there's a ton of sugar around, now we're like super sensitive and we can put on fat just a little bit too quickly. Right. And so what was meant to be a survival gene is now driving obesity and diabetes. And so that we think that mutation is very important in this. And one of the consequences is gout. And one of the consequences of gout is crystals. And we also, along with this, another casualty is that before the uric acid was degraded by an enzyme, and now we have to get rid of the uric acid through our kidneys. And so if we're eating a lot of food and there's a high amount of uric acid, that's a big job for the kidneys to do. And remember that the uric acid can crystallize because it's not very soluble. So there's a lot of people that get kidney stones. Like if you have gout, you can get kidney stones, you can get crystals in the urine. And your work has been particularly superb at showing that crystals in the urine can actually cause kidney damage. The crystals activate inflammatory processes along the lining of the tubule and then in the kidneys, and then causes inflammation and damage to the kidneys. And so another consequence of this mutation was that it's increasing our risk for kidney disease and for these crystals. And we can get rid of the crystals by trying to keep the urine alkaline, because it's really an acidic urine where you see these crystals. And so again, this is a compliment to you and your work developing this keto citra.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, you've done actually even long before us. You have done the work and have showed that alkalinizing even with bicarbonate is already beneficial. and helps the kidneys flush out uric acid. So,
Yeah.
So let's talk about it. So gout, you mentioned there's like 8 million people with gout or so in the US, roughly,
I
right?
think, yes, it's,
Around that. Yeah.
yep, it's
So
right around that number.
it's pretty common.
Yep.
But then there's another statistic which somehow it's not so much on everyone's radar, which is that like 80 to 90% of people with gout will develop chronic kidney disease. And it's a staggeringly high number.
It's staggering.
Right. And it seems to be not so much on the radar. When people have gout, they say, okay, it's my joints, that's my problem, not realizing that the next thing that will happen is they are losing their kidneys, right? So
yeah, there's a marriage between gout and the kidney. The crystals, although they're forming in the joints, it's very common for people with gout to have crystals in their urine and to have crystals in their kidneys. And in the days before people were really on uric acid lowering drugs, if you had gout at autopsy, like 90% plus had kidney disease. And the vast majority of them have crystals in their kidneys. So the crystals are also forming in the kidney. And interestingly, we think is the way it works is the crystals precipitate initially in the urine, in the acid urine, and then they catch on the tubule and they rupture through the tubule and they get into the kidney tissue. So, there's some data that if you take bicarbonate, you can slow the progression of kidney disease. And this may be one of the mechanisms is to prevent those crystals.
Right. No, absolutely. Strangely, a few decades ago, people began doubting that uric acid crystals have anything to do with chronic kidney disease in people with gout. I never quite understood why that was a theory, and it doesn't
There
really.
were three things that happened. So one of the things that happened was that when they did kidney biopsies, they didn't see crystals, but that's because they're biopsying the superficial part of the kidney and the crystals are deep. But that was confusing people. And then a second problem is that when they found the crystals, they were patchy and around in the center of the kidney, and it was hard to explain why the whole kidney was affected if it was crystals that were focal. When we started doing experiments, we found that it wasn't just crystals, but high uric acid itself could activate and cause inflammation in the kidney. So it's not just the crystals, it's also the effects of soluble but elevated uric acid. Another problem was that there was this worry that the medicines used to lower uric acid could have serious side effects occasionally. So there was a lot of reluctance by physicians to try to lower uric acid unless it was absolutely clear that it was the cause. And so there was, and so then what they found was that a lot of people who had the crystals in the kidney also had high blood pressure and were obese and had diabetes. And so it became a little bit unclear as to how much of the kidney disease was from the high blood pressure and how much was from the crystals. So in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a shift in the thinking, and everyone said, nah, it's unlikely uric acid. It's probably high blood pressure and obesity and diabetes that's causing. And then our group started finding that there was evidence that uric acid really was causing kidney disease. And so that it's kind of shifted back, and it's continued to be kind of controversial. But I think the evidence is really getting strong again that uric crystals in particular are likely causing some of the kidney damage. And some studies suggest that 1/3 of patients with gout have a lot of crystals in their kidneys. And a lot of people, and if you have kidney stones, it's usually linked with having crystals in the kidney as well. So it's probably real.
I'm totally with
gout
you.
and the kidney love each other.
Right. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And all the others are wrong. But there's an interesting disease, a mysterious disease, where you think, and I think you're again absolutely right, where you think uric acid is maybe the central player, and that's sometimes called Mesoamerican nephropathy.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could give us a quick rundown
Yeah.
of what that's
So
all about.
there's this mysterious epidemic of kidney disease, and it's been going on for about 15, 20 years. And it's occurring in Central America, mainly along the Pacific coast, like in, I would say like El Salvador, Nicaragua, those kind of Costa Rica. It's occurring in Mexico. It's occurring in India. It's occurring in Sri Lanka. And a lot of it's usually among people working outside in a very hot environment. They're usually agricultural workers, classically sugarcane workers. And they're developing kidney failure in their 20s. And that's like extremely uncommon. Like if you have diabetes, you get kidney disease in your 40s or 50s, so you can get it when you're young, but it's, typically high blood pressure causes kidney disease in the 40s and 50s and 60s, not when you're 18 or 22. And these people are developing kidney failure. No one knows what's causing it. They don't have obesity. They don't have diabetes. They don't have high blood pressure, but a lot of them have uric acid crystals in their urine. And what we do know is that when you get dehydrated, you tend to make your urine acid, and so it can cause precipitation of the uric acid. And when you're working out and you're working hard, your muscles break down in a little bit, just from hard work, and that generates uric acid. So you're out there in the heat, you're generating uric acid while you're working. Your urine is getting scant and reduced in volume and acidic, so the uric acid concentration's high in the urine. So we started doing these studies where we looked at workers when they went in there into the sugarcane field in the morning and when they came out in the afternoon, and we found that they were generating uric acid while they were working there. Their serum uric acid went up during the day. Their urine pH, or which measures the acid, the urine became more acidic during the day, and they started forming crystals. And it was about 15% of the workers had crystals in their urine at any one time, it seemed. And then the story is kind of interesting. I was getting these urines sent to me, and from about 20 workers, and one time only 8 urine samples came up, or 8 paired urine samples. And I said, what happened? And they said, well, don't even study. We could only get 8 samples today. But we looked at it, and it was all 8 had uric acid crystals, and it was huge, and the concentrations were super high. They were at a level that we would see acute kidney injury with in people undergoing chemotherapy, where they release a lot of uric acid. There's a syndrome where you go into acute kidney failure, and they had uric acid levels of that level. It was like unbelievable, all 8. And I knew that there was something wrong with that day. So I Googled, and I found out that was the hottest day in the year. And I realized that what was happening is these guys, there was a heat wave that came, and they weren't ready for it. So they weren't drinking enough fluids. And that's why there were only 8, because 12 of them left early because that was just so hot. But these poor 8 guys that kept working the whole day, they became dehydrated, and they all got these massive crystals that we know can cause kidney damage. So we think that that's playing a role in this disease. We're not convinced it's the only cause, but it also made us realize that climate change could be a player, and that by climate change has only changed the temperature, a degree or so, but the heat waves have gone up by 50, 70%. And so these heat waves are the danger from climate change. It's not the actual absolute rise in temperature so much as it is these big heat waves that come in and nail people, and that this could be playing a role in the kidney damage.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And, you published a really nice paper, kind of like arguing why uric acid would make high sense to be involved in Mesoamerican nephropathy, and I think it's completely correct. And of course, it's been actually really a pleasure to have had a bunch of meetings with you on trying to figure out how we could set up a clinical trial together with all those folks that in
Yeah, I hope
Mesoamerica.
it happens. I
It
really
would be
hope it happens
fantastic.
because
Yeah.
I think that your keto citro really has that potential to help with both components, because you have this thing that blocks inflammation, and at the same time you can help prevent the crystals from forming, and this would be a wonderful group to test it in. So let's hope that this thing will go through.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yes, and we're pushing, we're working hard to make this happen. Well, let's see. We're at the top of the hour. Let's find out where can people find out more about Rick Johnson. Are there websites? Are there social media? Of course, there's a book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. Here we go. That everyone can, of course, get. Where should people go?
Well, I do have a website. It's drrichardjohnson.com. So
Okay,
that's
excellent.
easy.
That's easy.
So, and I have lots of stuff in there. I have podcasts, but I also have little things that about research and stories. And there's, you can keep yourself busy there if you're interested in this kind of thing. My book actually has very strong recommendations on different kinds of foods and diets and what the evidence is. And then I have a Instagram, Dr. Richard J. Johnson, and Twitter, at Richard Johns or Richard Johns 11.
Okay. Perfect. We'll get all those links and we'll put them down there so people can follow up. Great. Well, last word goes to you, Rick. And I know you have a dinner coming up soon. So
a low carb dinner.
A low carb dinner. Perfect.
It's going to be a salad tonight.
Nice. And a glass of water.
Yes, water for sure. I really appreciate being on your show. I think you're doing some really wonderful work, both scientifically research and now you to the clinic and trying to make a difference. And so I applaud you on your efforts. It was a pleasure to be on your show. And if anyone is interested, you can also look up my stuff through PubMed, and you can always email me, and I'm always open to help people. And I'm a physician first, and so I always want to try to do the best to try to improve healthcare. And that's what led my research to why I'm so passionate about this is, to try to make a difference. So, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Rick. Really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch shortly anyway, because we're planning all these trials. Excellent. Have a great dinner. And thank you again for coming on the show. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas.